Perfect. Hello, everyone. So welcome to Heritage Abbotsford Society's Culture Days webinar on Stories to Spaces, Local Community Places. It's great to see you all virtually in this strange new time. So we'll get started here, and it looks like I can move forward on the PowerPoint.
The arrow keys.
The arrow keys. I am trying the arrow keys.
Oh God.
Oh, there we go. All right, I figured it out. So housekeeping. That's the thing about virtual meetings. You never know when technology is going to be a little bit of a glitch. So I do appreciate your graciousness in any sort of glitches that may happen. It's a strange time in COVID, but we're just going to go over some housekeeping rules. I know most of you are probably very familiar with Zoom and virtual meetings, but just in case, please keep your microphones on mute until we have a question and answer or a public suggestions part of this webinar. That's just so that it's less distracting for everyone else without hearing, road noise or background conversations, etc. Participant video is optional. I know that at some meetings it's required, but we want this opportunity to be as comfortable and enjoyable for everyone. And this session is being recorded. So some people feel uncomfortable about that. If you do, just please do let us know, and we'll try to be cognizant of that in future and make sure that your information is private. So those are just a few things. So before we start, I do want to acknowledge that I am on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Stalo people. Locally, that means the Samath First Nation, who are located at Sumas Mountain, and the Matsqui First Nation, who are by the Fraser River. And we give thanks that we're on that land, that we are able to live here, and we are very grateful for that. I am situated right now at the Heritage Abbotsford Society offices in Abbotsford at Mill Lake. And I also want to acknowledge that we are on Nooksack land, or land where the Nooksack have some, title as well, even though there is an arbitrary, at least to the First Nations, arbitrary line between America and Canada. So I just want to make sure that we are situated on that land before we go forward. So I'm Natalia Deros, and I work as the programs manager here at the Heritage Abbotsford Society. And the Heritage Abbotsford Society was known until quite recently as the Msa Museum Society, and we've been around for over 50 years now, since 1969, I believe. And our mission is to preserve and record all of the stories of Abbotsford, and in any way that may be. So part of our programming and our mandate is also, or not our mandate, but our programming is to manage the Topophilia House Heritage Site, which you can see to the right there. There's a beautiful picture of the Rose Gardens. And so we run tours through the Topophilia House in a way to tell the story of Abbotsford. From the very beginning, before resettlers came to this land with the Indigenous people, all the way to the present time. So the house itself tells the story of our local community. It is in fact a place, which we'll go into a little bit in a bit. But Heritage Abbotsford Society does a lot more than just Topophilia House. We do programming around walking tours in different parts of the city. We have a collection of archives. We're building up an archives of local stories. And we are working on, collectively, our curator and collections manager and our researchers are working on an upcoming exhibit on local First Nations history and land claims, specifically around the Matsqui peoples, First Nation, and which is really exciting, and I really hope that you stay tuned for that. There's a picture of me running the Downtown Abbotsford walking tour last summer, which is great fun because I was able to talk a little bit about the history of each building and the stories of the people who inhabited them, and kind of go through the history of Abbotsford, and very place-based learning that way. So yeah, stay tuned. If you are interested in any walking tours, we do have them occasionally, although with COVID right now, it's a little bit difficult. And another part of, another thing that we do at Heritage Abbotsford is also to look at built heritage and the preservation of local sites and features that might have historical importance to our community as well. So we do have that in our work as well. The Stories to Spaces, Local Community Places is a program that was launched this summer, the summer of 2020. And the idea was really to not just focus on the built heritage, which is an important aspect of community placemaking, absolutely, but also on the stories of everyone who's lived in this area. So there's a map of Abbotsford. We are geographically bound to some extent because we are a heritage society specifically for this area. I do like to use the term the area that is now known as Abbotsford, or currently known as Abbotsford, because different people have different groups have different names for this area, and I didn't want it to be so place-bound that would seem, exclusive to others. For example, the local Stalo people here, who we are trying to really build and develop those relationships through the development of our upcoming exhibit. And we have staff members who belong to the Stalo community. They call this land, all of Stalo territory, Saltamek. And so I think it's important to realize that names have power, and so maybe resettlers call Abbotsford the name that John McClure gave the area so many years ago, but other people have different names for it too, which is why I very intentionally didn't put Abbotsford in the title of the program in order for it to be as inclusive as possible. So Stories to Spaces, there's a nice little logo. Our former communications, my colleague Andrew very nicely put that together, and he put together some different important built heritage, and another one of our logos is a tree. So we don't want to just limit a space or a place to a built heritage. It's the stories that are really important, and we'll get a little bit more into that in a bit. So what is placemaking? So here's a nice little long description of what placemaking is. It's a geographical term. It's a multifaceted approach to planning, design, and management of public spaces. So placemaking capitalizes on a local community's assets, inspiration, and potential with the intention of creating public spaces that promotes people's health, happiness, and well-being. So heritage placemaking is really looking at the history, the places where people have that attachment to a story around a certain place. And in the end goal, it's really to be a way to bring different communities together to create one large community and really celebrate the things that make us unique, and commonalities and just a shared understanding of where people are coming from. There are some criticisms that placemaking itself can be very institutional, which is something that I was very conscious of, but I think placemaking, when it really comes down to it, especially when it's interactive with the rest of the community, it can kind of transcend that too. So that's my hope, and we'll kind of go into a little bit more. So a place, I'm just going to look at my notes. A place it's interesting because it's more than just a spot on the map. Places are experienced and lived. They're not bounded areas, but connected movements of networks of social relations and understandings. So that can really, it's very all-encompassing. It can include sites such as our features and buildings. So buildings like over to the left, you can see Ivana's Tea House, which is no longer sadly in business due to COVID and the fact that that built heritage, which is one of the Gosling buildings in the downtown Abbotsford, right on Montrose Avenue, is slated to be torn down and replaced with a two-story building with heritage features, but like the building right next to it, which is where Spruce Collective, for example, is currently at. So that kind of is interesting because there's not that many mechanisms in place to really protect and preserve heritage buildings or buildings with heritage meaning, because heritage designation is a whole set of mechanisms and protocols where there needs to be a bylaw. It's very institutional. There needs to be, you know, municipal support and protection kind of on a policy level, which is definitely the end goal. We do want to preserve our buildings because they tell stories. They're artifacts in and of themselves, just like Trethewey House tells the story of Abbotsford. And not only the story of Abbotsford, it's a beautiful example of an arts and crafts house. So again, the little Gosling house, the Goslings were very instrumental in the development of the historic Abbotsford downtown. That house kind of does tell the story of the Goslings. And I think it's important with the preservation because the Goslings were, you know, working class people, and they built up their business, but I don't think places have to be grand necessarily. As much as we love aesthetically Trethewey House, places like the Gosling House are also important. But because it is being torn down in the next year or so, the cultural significance of that spot still remains, which brings us to the placemaking, where we might not actually have a building to commemorate something, and as much as that's the end goal, we still have the stories, and we still have the people and the memories and the echoes of that kind of story in that geographical area. So cultural significance is not just a built place. It can be a place where an event happened that was really important to the community. From our archives, I brought up this interesting picture of when Queen Elizabeth and King George VI actually visited Abbotsford, well, Matsqui, on the train. And I think that was really interesting because it was a really huge event for the population of Abbotsford at that time. So again, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying we should put up a plaque to commemorate it, but it's a really kind of interesting historical moment that had a lot of importance to a group of people. And it's interesting that that happened to Little Abbotsford. Again, a tree. I think it's really, really important that we are not just bound physically to, bound to built heritage or man-made heritage, but that a tree can also tell a story. Trees, especially if we are looking at Indigenous placemaking, and I'm not Indigenous myself, but our curator is a collections manager and the one working on the exhibit, and just sort of looking at placemaking from a different lens than just, you know, man-made, but looking at the story of, let's say, a cedar tree or the important cultural significance it might have to a group of people. So placemaking really can be very all-encompassing and inclusive. So what is community heritage then? I'm going to go back to my notes and then just read something that I thought was cool. Community identification of heritage is likely to be more inclusive and expansive than that of professional determinations. For example, a project in Australia, for example, identified heritage as non-static and always living, always moving. The need to recognize both expert and community knowledge and to include communities in decisions around these things. So it implies a contemporary attachment to places. That is what is identified and valued by the community itself, not just you know, the institutions or the experts. It's the people themselves. So it's supposed to be more, in Foucault's terms, it is a discourse against power. So people can decide what's important to them. And it could be your family farm. It could be the, I just took a little picture from our archives of the Little Mountain Dairy on Montrose. And the thing that really came up while we were doing, you know, the downtown Abbotsford placemaking project, where we mapped out different stories for the walking tour, was that a lot of people who didn't necessarily, just, you know, everyday people, like people who grew up in Abbotsford a long time ago. The places that really were important weren't necessarily, you know, City Hall, where a lot of the building or the big decisions were being made, but were places like Little Mountain Dairy or the Teddy Bear Cafe, where those connections were formed, where those memories were made, where people fell in love, broke up, you know, mourned, celebrated daily acts of life. So I think it's really important to look at, what do you think, what are the heritage sites of tomorrow? What places do you think are so important to you and to your communities right now that we should be talking about in 50 years? And in a way that brings in the inclusion, and the way that communities are really formed is through these attachment to places, which brings me to the term topophilia, which is a geographical term. I do have a background in geography, human geography, which is why I'm kind of bringing in these ideas. But topophilia is the bonding, the effective bonding between people and places. It's the love of place. So even if you think of, I mean, this is a really sad kind of example, but when you're driving around and you see those street side memorials where there's maybe some religious symbols, flowers, teddy bears, objects that were really meaningful to the people who maybe died nearby, that is an example of, it's a very tragic example of topophilia, where people feel very connected to a place where a soul departed, you know, a loved one left, you know, this existence. So again, we wouldn't necessarily commemorate as a community on an official level, but that is a commemoration of a place, is you know, so that is an example of topophilia. It also kind of goes into intangible heritage. So intangible heritage, you know, that harkens back to the previous slide, where maybe the Gosling building is no longer going to be there as, you know, an example of built heritage, but the intangible heritage is the legacy of the family, the Goslings in that area, and the stories. So intangible heritage can mean anything from, it's usually the culture, the values, the language, and everything that kind of encompasses that, which could be, you know, food, it could be customs, it could be religious practices. It's all sort of the parts of society that bonds us to each other in a common kind of language that goes beyond words. So again, like, the community heritage is supposed to be inclusive, in that every person's story is important. Part of my passion for this project is, you know, my experiences a few years ago when I was working as a summer student at a seniors care home. And my job was literally to talk to elderly people and people with dementia on their stories, and to find out what was important to them in their life. And some of them were maybe beyond verbal ability to really share that. And I talked to their families about that. And it was a way of celebrating somebody's life on a very inclusive level, because most of these people, you know, were working class people. They never, you know, were in the news, the media. They never necessarily rose to positions of official power, but most of them were very dearly loved and had really interesting experiences in lives. And the ones who I were able to, you know, have conversations with, often what they first said was like, oh, my life wasn't important. Why would you be interested in me? And I, you know, would try to say, well, no, actually, I'm sure your memories are important. And, you know, through those discussions, we were able to, just letting somebody in. So I was able to really develop those bonds and tell those stories. So that was, in a way, kind of intangible heritage too, right? Storytelling is intangible heritage. A lot of the folks who I did talk to didn't necessarily grow up in Abbotsford. You know, maybe they moved there later in life, or they were brought to a seniors care home by their family who lived in Abbotsford. So it wasn't as place-based, but it was definitely intangible heritage to that family. So I do think it's interesting and important to to iterate that every person's story is important. We maybe as a heritage organization or as a whole community will have to just sort of sort through which stories we do decide collectively are the most important. But I do think for this project, it's important that everyone feels like they have that agency and that importance in telling their story. So what are the heritage sites of tomorrow? So I just randomly put up a local cafe just to say like, hey, maybe things that happened at Sipchai Cafe, you know, or the discussions or the open mics or maybe the first dates and all sorts of things. Maybe that's a heritage place for tomorrow. We'll see. So I'm going to go into a little bit about the project itself. So I'm going to start with Larissa Williams, our collections manager's beautiful story about Saltamek, which is our world, the word in Hulkamelam, the local indigenous language. Saltamek means our world. And she was very gracious to share this with us, and I think it's really important to be very grateful for the knowledge that we are able to be given, and because it's, you know, with the history of colonialism, it was often very brutally taken away, or tried very intentionally. The effort was to take that away, so in a form of cultural genocide. So when, you know, somebody is willing to share that story, that's also a gift. And I think that's really important to recognize too, that, you know, some people may be like, absolutely, I don't feel comfortable sharing this story. This story is so important to me and my community that I'm not ready to give it to the world. But also on the other hand, when it is given to us, anyone's story, but especially those from maybe historically marginalized people, it should be received with a lot of gratitude and graciousness in being given the opportunity to understand and to learn. So I just want to read out this beautiful sort of paragraph that Larissa wrote, which was that this project is about sharing our stories about our collective home, regardless of the names we use, whether that's Abbotsford or Saltamek. The tree that defines home, the mountains that define home, the place where you spent your free time in your childhood, the spot on the river where your parents and elders taught you how to catch fish and gut them, clean them, and the variety of methods of preservation. All of these places and more hold importance for people in our communities and have stories that deserve to be told. So thank you, Larissa, for sharing that. And I highly recommend you to go to our website, on our Facebook page, Stories to Spaces, or our Instagram, Stories to Spaces, and read these stories for yourself. So again, the idea for this project, I've spent the last, you know, year or so writing little stories about local buildings, just sort of building on my love for telling stories when it was, you know, whether it's the house tour at Trethewey House, where I'm telling the story of Abbotsford, or the walking tours, where, you know, I do a lot of extra research, so I might know the heritage, the sort of when the buildings were, you know, built, and the materials and the businesses, which are really important facts in the whole story. But also, I spent a lot of time reading contemporary accounts from when those buildings were built, and just finding out the little details that would connect people on these walking tours to the lived environment. Because as much as it's interesting, and everyone has a different interest, some people might be really fascinated by the different types of Claiborne brick that made that building, but most people, I find, really relate to the stories of, say, you know, the local fires and the ways that people came together to try to save the downtown, or, you know, who opened up their upstairs, you know, apartment for the mothers with babies while everyone else was fighting the fires, or that, you know, Mrs. Albert Lee was the only one who was the main lady who would go and help everyone clean up after a fire, after everything was done, or, you know, things like that. Those stories are really what connects people to places. So I was doing different research and writing fairly well-received stories about buildings in the downtown, over the spring, for example, and people found them quite interesting generally. And I really enjoyed that part, and I was kind of thinking of how it can become bigger or a little more expansive in a storytelling way. And I came across through our Heritage Abbotsford Society's book, Pioneer Stories, the story of the Kamimuras. And the Kamimuras were a resettler family from Japan, and they lived off of Downs and Murphy Road. Now, Downs Road at that time was apparently, according to Spud Murphy, the former alderman who's now passed away, Downs Road was mostly that of Japanese Canadian families, or what they call the Issei and the Nisei, first generation Japanese Canadians. And it was a very large community, of course, due to the colonial constructs of Canada at that time. They were considered second best kind of citizens of Canada. They didn't have all the same access to rights, and there's a lot of racism on a national level as well as a local level. But I did read from, the accounts from Spud Murphy and other people who knew these Japanese Canadian families, that they were also, it was a both and. They also had a lot of connections with their local neighbors, and a lot of community involvement, and they had their own strong, vibrant community where they would meet for Buddhist celebrations every few weeks, and ceremonies, as well as, the night of church had a Japanese component as well. The children went to Japanese school every Saturday. They would actually tell the stories of Japanese legends, and they'd have Japanese silent films, and there'd be one man who would do all the voices. I guess he was an amateur actor. So it was a very strong community that was very unfortunately ripped away during the internment of 1942 after the war. It was in America when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and America declared war on Japan. All Japanese citizens and those of Japanese descent, and a lot of the people who were interned were born in Canada, were sent away to internment camps in, I think the closest was around Lillooet, but as far as away as, kind of in the Nelson area, and as far as away as in a lot of places in Alberta, the sugar beet farms. And so a once vibrant part of this area was there one day and gone the next. And it's not really part of our local history that we really talk about. We talk about it maybe as a BC history, but we don't really talk about it as an Abbotsford history. And I was reading through the story by the Kamimuras, and Walter Kamimura was very gracious to give his story. He was born in Abbotsford, and I think he was sent away with his family in internment when he was about 6, which is when he last lived in this area. And the Kamimuras had a building on their farm, and this is what it looks like currently. And it served as a Buddhist temple, as well as a community hall and a language school for the Japanese community. They were called the Claiborne community, Japanese community, but they were mostly off of Downs Road. And it's interesting that it's still standing. It's a commemoration of that entire community and all of their efforts. And it's also a symbol of the internment too, in a way, right? It tells the entire story. So again, looking at a site or a built heritage as a commemoration or an artifact that tells that story. So we're lucky that we still have it. And even though nobody really knows, the people who lived on the property, I did talk to them because I did search it out, and they were very gracious and very nice, and they're like, oh, I had no idea, that's really interesting. And they've obviously utilized it as a chicken coop. So it's interesting that it holds so much cultural significance, so much intangible heritage there, and it's still being used. But of course, even if it wasn't, it is still the site of that could tell that story too. But we do still have it. Yeah, so what do we want to commemorate. So community historians, that's the thing, you know, I've reached out to my networks. I've reached out to a few UFE students who are local history majors who go to UFE. And they were really excited to write some things. So Gina Weeb very graciously wrote a feature on the vanished village of Gifford, which not many people know about, actually, that it had its own post office. It's right by it's just past Matsqui, in between Matsqui and Mount Lehman. And that is the general store to the left there on the PowerPoint. And it's been turned into a house, a private house. And there is the school that's still standing too, but it's fairly run down. And you can tell when you're driving through the roads that the geography of the area, you can kind of tell that it was a place where a lot of people lived, just the way that the train goes, and then there's the general store. And I think it looks like it could have been a place, like a hub, a village at one point, but it's kind of vanished. It's sort of like our local ghost community is what we called it, because it's not really a ghost town, but it's like a ghost community. So she was very nice in writing about that, and I've reached out to quite a few people. So we have a man of Hungarian descent who's writing a feature on the 56ers, which are the Hungarian refugees from the revolution of 1956, who lived in the Abbotsford airport for quite a few months. And that's a really interesting community story, because there was a lot of community involvement in helping them learn English. The UBC forestry department, pretty much the entire the forestry department at the university in Hungary was there, and then they got hired at the UBC forestry department. And so it's interesting because the Abbotsford airport tells so many different stories, and it's not just about the Royal Air Force or World War II. It's also about the flood of '48, where a lot of people were evacuated there. It tells the story of the Abbotsford Air Show. It tells the story of the 56ers, and then of course it tells the story now of the fact that air technology and whatnot is one of the biggest, I guess, sectors, industries in Abbotsford today. So that's a culturally significant site on so many levels. I wrote a story about the curious case of the man in the stump, because the first settler that we know of in this area who lived in the downtown was a man who lived in a large cedar tree stump. It's a very comedic story, but it also, I intentionally told it because, in the area around Jubilee Park, there's a lot of street entrenched people who live in that area. And there's also, gentrification and the kind of sometimes an intent to push, people out of spaces that they call home. And I wanted to reflect and kind of bring back the story to, well, maybe this land is always, from the indigenous peoples who were a little, who use the land, but also in settler terms, maybe this land has never been for the wealthy either. So every story can tell a different perspective, whether it's that of, people who are really powerful or people who aren't so powerful. So what do we want to commemorate, right? That's the big question. So just a short reflection. What are 3 places of cultural significance in your life? You don't have to share them. If you want to share them, you can. If these places are in what is currently known as Abbotsford, please let me know, because I would love to research it. And then I guess this question leads to, does this reflection about the places in your life make you feel more connected to your own environment? So if you want to share, you can put your hand up, and Sarah, our lovely communications officer, is next to me, and she can see it in the chat, and you can unmute yourself and speak. And if you would just like to reflect over the next few days and think about it, that's totally fine too. But I'm just going to give you this opportunity if you like. Yeah, and no one's sharing. Yeah, okay, that's fine. So there are some challenges to this project too, and different things that have come up. So community participation, we're just going to keep on plugging because, you know, I think there is interest. I think people do want to tell these stories. And I've been promised like probably 5 different stories, but, you know, it's a thoughtful process, right? If you really want to tell a story well, and it's really important to you and your family or your community, you really want to think about it and you want to present it. And it's not really time bound. So that's something that, you know, I was told, oh, you know, I'll have it to you in 2 weeks or so, and it's been, you know, 2 months or whatever, and that's fine. I don't think there needs to be a rush. That's up to me as a programmer to like figure out which stories need to be celebrated, you know, on my end, so I can just keep on researching stories and reaching out. But I do really want this project to be something that people can be local historians or can really tell their own stories in their own words if they wish. So there's been some really good feedback. For example, I've reached out to a few places and institutions or even family businesses who are really interested, and I've started chatting with them. So I'll be the one who's writing the story, because kind of like a journalist in that they don't necessarily want to write it themselves, but they really would like to see their story told. And of course, with that, from the kind of community development perspective, I'm going to try to write it as closely as I can interpret from a secondary person, because I know that I will always be biased in some way, coming from my mind, but I will try to make it as collaborative as possible, and that they will have final say in the story that's published. So I'll try to remove myself as much as possible, but I mean, obviously that's impossible completely, but that's sort of the intent. So keep your eyes out for future stories that might be from other different families and groups. And then of course the other thing is the celebration of resettler stories on unceded land. I do think it's important to recognize that as much as we talk about inclusion and multiculturalism, we are all here as resettlers on Indigenous land, on the Stalo people's land, and that we are guests, and some people feel uncomfortable with that, and I personally think that everyone's story is important, but I think we need to be very conscious as storytellers and historians that we're always aware of the ethics of that, right? And that kind of goes into opposing narratives. You know, reading about heritage placemaking, you know, I do think that this project is an opportunity to talk about some difficult things in the most ethical way possible. So sometimes there might be stories that come from opposing belief systems, and obviously we need to be very conscious of how we present that in as much of as non-harmful way as possible. But I don't think that all narratives have to be, I think that this project is open enough, hopefully, where we can have those difficult conversations sometimes without hiding anything, right? And the ethics of commemorating places where negative events occurred. So again, if we're thinking of Topophilia, and we're looking at roadside memorials, for example, obviously it's important to the people who put those memorials up. It's very important to them that they're commemorating their loved ones that way. But is it right for, let's say, me to start talking about that when it's not really my story, especially when it's so painful? And that kind of goes into the whole, like, you tell your story, I'm not the one telling your story. So that's the whole kind of purpose of the community placemaking heritage project. So some things like, so for example, the lynching of Louis Sam, which was a very traumatic and very dark time, an incident that occurred in this area in 1884. A 14-year-old youth, child really, Louis Sam was unfairly accused of a murder down in Nooksack like Whatcom area, Nooksack area. And he was here, he was part of the Samath Nation, and he was back on the reservation. And the complaint came, and he was arrested by, Canadian law enforcement. And that night, a whole band of American settlers came up and dragged him off and lynched him from a tree. And that happened just on the border here between, I think it was on American soil, but just at the border, right by Sumas. And I do have a pretty good idea of where it happened based on the topology of the map and whatnot, but I don't think that that's a story that is mine to tell for sure, because it's a very tragic story to the Samath peoples and the Stala people in general. But also there is a danger of commemorating spaces where things that happened, if we think of grave sites of people who were dictators, for example, we want to be conscious of not commemorating or celebrating. Well, we can commemorate, but not celebrate these dark things that happen. So we have to be very careful ethically about how we go forward. So yeah, future direction. So that's a nice little picture. It's a postcard of the Godson House, which is a beautiful little arts and crafts house right on the corner of Bevan and Ware, just down the street. And I think it's, oh, somebody else is entering. I put it up there because not only is it a very pretty arts and crafts house, it is one of the oldest houses we really have in the area. And again, just based on the community so far's directions in preserving built heritage, we've never really had mechanisms. I mean, there's a few. There's the village and school in Clayburn, and there's Trethewey House, and there's the National Historic Site, the Sikh Guru Gurdwara on South Fraser Way, but we don't really have mechanisms municipally in protecting built heritage, or even really valuing built heritage until maybe there's been pockets of people, but not really as a whole group. So I just wanted to put that picture up there because it is one of our oldest and most beautiful little houses, and I think it is going to be put on the market soon. There was an article in Abbey News about it, so hopefully it will not be torn down because I think that would be such a sad shame. But future direction. So at this point, it's just a community, not just, but it's a community participatory heritage placemaking project where people can tell their own stories, but it can go so many ways. We can have signage, about certain things. We can have programming around the stories that are shared. We can have I don't know, programs where, people remember the places that were really important and kind of impart that knowledge to the next generations. This is kind of also an advocacy project for really preserving old buildings and making people aware of why we should, because again, people are like, oh, well, we could have, 24 new high rises. Well, why should we share that? But I think by connecting the spaces geographically and the built places with those stories, hopefully that the intent is that people will feel more emboldened to really preserve and save that history and to talk about everything, whether it's negative, sad things, or stories of conflicts between communities. It's hopefully broad enough, and that we can have these conversations, and really the intent at the end is to come to some sort of shared understanding, even within our differences, and really understand who we are as a community. We're so diverse here. We are on unceded land. Really, like, who are we? What is our identity? And I think heritage and placemaking and storytelling all married together can start, having those conversations and really solidifying, clarifying those questions. So that brings me to any questions for me, and you can chat or raise your hand in the in the Zoom call, or type in your questions. Sarah is managing the chat. She's right next to me, so she can read them out to me and I can read them to you. And also, if you have any culturally significant places situated in the Abbotsford area that you would like to nominate, I'm always open for nominations and places because I feel like a bit like a historical detective, and it's quite fun to go down these rabbit trails and holes and actually come out with something really beautiful. And again, if you want to volunteer yourself as a community historian and want to get published, I am happy to publish your stories through the project. If you have an idea and want to co-write with some staff, you know, I'm happy to help you craft a story. And that's another future direction. This could be a programming thing where people learn how to write stories or learn how to write or tell something important, you know, about their family and community. So if there's any questions.
Well, Ted just made the point that if we spoke to people at seniors facilities, that it could really bring out a lot of stories.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. I was lucky enough before COVID, it was like a week before the pandemic, and I did a presentation on Abbotsford history, and I actually did a presentation for Abbotsford, what's it called? It's the group that meet at the ARC. I think it's a seniors kind of presentation series. I forget what it's called. They were very lovely people. And my goodness, the stories that came out, some in both of them, and you know, people coming up to me afterwards and sharing like, oh yes, a flood of 48, you know, and it was just so illuminating and really cool. Yeah, so I completely agree. I think even with the whole, that would be a way to create a vibrant community and you know, a healthy communities to really celebrate our elders, our senior citizens. Yeah, and all the knowledge they have to offer.
Eileen just wants to mention that it's called Learning Plus.
Thank you, Eileen. Eileen is my mother, so thank you. Learning Plus, yes, that is what it is called. Yes, and my email is up there, has@heritageabbotsford.ca. The picture to the right, I just needed to put that up because it is, that's the preserve building, the Msa Centennial Library. It was built for I think the centennial of the province, not Canada, but of BC's 100 years. And it's I think it's a beautiful building in that kind of cubic, postmodern, kind of unusual for Abbotsford, really, to have a building like that still standing. And there was talks of it being demolished, but luckily it was saved. And now Tourism Abbey, as for Downtown Business Association, City Studio, which is U of E's program, and Banter Ice Cream, apparently they have really good ice cream, are all there. And it's really cool to see, again, a heritage building having new life with hopefully another 100 years, or well, I guess 50 years, or however long it's been around. Anyway, yeah, so thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your attendance, and yeah, let me know if you have any future stories. Thank you.